Today our session is going to be about Nate Patrin's book, The Needle and the Lens: Pop Goes to the Movies from Rock and Roll to Synthwave, and Nate will be in conversation with Michaelangelo Matos. My name is Gus Stadler, and I co-organize the series along with Kimberly Mack, Antonia Randolph, Francesca Royster, and Carl Wilson, as well as a series co-founder Eric Weisbard, who's currently on sabbatical and abroad. If you're not on the mailing list but would like to be, please email Francesca Royster at froyster, FROYSTER, like FR Oyster, at depaul.edu, DEPAUL.edu. You can see all of the previous sessions on Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel. Our next session will be taking place on February 5th. That's 2 weeks from today. And will feature Corey Miles, the author of Vibe, The Sound and Feeling of Black Life in the American South, and Kemi Adeyemi, the author of Feels Right, Black Queer Women and the Politics of Partying in Chicago. I will now briefly introduce our speakers. Nate Patrin is a longtime music critic whose writing has appeared in dozens of publications, including Pitchfork, RIP, Stereogum, Spin, Bandcamp Daily, Red Bull Music Academy, and his hometown Twin Cities late alt weekly City Pages. His first book, Bring That Beat Back: How Sampling Built Hip Hop, was named a Best Music Book of 2020 by Kirkus and Rolling Stone. Michaelangelo Matos is the author of Sign of the Times, The Underground is Massive and Can't Slow Down. He's at work on a history of Lou Adler's and LA Rock's 60s and 70s for Hachette. And please, as the presentation is proceeding, questions come up for you, please put them in the chat. And at the end of the presentation from Nate and Michaelangelo, Antonia will ask you to unmute and ask your question. You can also use the chat just to chat or respond or make jokes. So without further ado, will hand things over to Nate and Michaelangelo.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm pretty psyched to be doing this. Nate is a friend, and he is the author of 2 excellent books, the newest of which is this one, The Needle and the Lens: Pop Goes to the Movies from Rock and Roll to Synthwave. I believe Nate is going to read us a section from the book. If you want to take it away, please.
Yes, just a moment here. I actually have to pull it up. I'm sorry to get it here. 1 moment. I'm sorry.
While Nate goes to get the book, I'm going to show it to you again.
I've forgotten something.
The book.
Yes, exactly. All right. So I'm going to read from the chapter on The Harder They Come and Jimmy Cliff's Many Rivers to Cross. At the time he wrote Many Rivers to Cross, Jimmy Cliff's own situation wasn't that much better than Ivan's in The Harder They Come. He'd arrived in England in 1965 after spending nearly all his teenage years working his way toward a stable music career, a path that took him through the more unscrupulous corners of the Jamaican record business, with a stopover at the 1964 New York World's Fair as part of an exhibition of Jamaican musical culture. Coming to the UK was Chris Blackwell's idea, Blackwell being the Island Records founder who took reggae international and would become one of pop music's biggest players. Cliff was laboring under the hopes that he'd get the same kind of break Blackwell found other singers of the West Indies, like 15-year-old pop ska sensation Millie Small, whose 1964 single My Boy Lollipop became a massive transatlantic smash even amid peak Beatlemania. The problem was that Cliff was still trying to figure out who he was as a musician. Prejudice was never far from worsening his situation. He was kicked out of at least one studio apartment when the landlord objected to a black man staying there. But Cliff's come up was further complicated by the fact that the British appetite for Caribbean music, whether it was the upbeat sounds of ska or its slower, more slippery mid-decade offshoot rocksteady, hadn't yet been whetted. Cliff would integrate folk and soul into his repertoire, which would work to his benefit. he tours as a support act for rock acts like The Who and the Spencer Davis Group, or as part of soul and blues revues featuring the likes of Freddie King and Junior Walker and the All-Stars. But that versatility came at the cost of an identity crisis, albeit one more thrust on him by the music press than anything. Then the hits came. Waterfall, a 1968 single, won him some attention via that year's International Festival of Song in Brazil, and the song's success there helped kick Cliff out of a rut. The following year's Wonderful World, Beautiful People perked ears in the States, the UK, and Jamaica, a clear-eyed and hopeful crossover bid that smuggled in some weapons-grade bottom-end groove beneath its pop-friendly strings. You Can Get It If You Really Want did well enough for Cliff, but it wound up an even bigger success when it was covered by Desmond Decker, proof that Cliff's strengths could be at least partially attributed to his skills as a songwriter. Still, Cliff's voice itself was hard to deny. The press caught on to his soul-indebted high-note singing as similar to Percy Sledge, but without the latter's ready-to-shatter fragility, and the combination of resonant singing and pop-profound songwriting was enough to make a single like Vietnam the envy of Bob Dylan. Throw in a cover of Cat Stevens' Wild World that immolated the smug original on Contact, Cliff actually sounds regretfully sympathetic instead of condescending, and he started looking very much like reggae's big international can't-miss star of the 70s. History tends to gloss over how quickly Cliff confounded those expectations. Cliff's next move was to record another cycle in Alabama's legendary cradle of soul, Muscle Shoals, inspired in part by how well the session band The Swampers gave the New York recorded Many Rivers to Cross an atmosphere worthy of Wilson Pickett or Aretha Franklin. But an audience expecting more deep roots reggae was thrown by an album heavy on Southern R&B instead. By 1972, he'd earned a reputation for not wanting to be pigeonholed as a reggae artist, which he explained to Let It Rock reporter Charlie Gillett as a pragmatic move. I felt that I wanted to show that I can do other than reggae because at the time, everybody was putting reggae down. Everybody, in his case meaning the press and the radio station. And yet he'd also risked alienating his Jamaican fans with the crossover moves too, admitting that, quote, "It cast a shadow on my career. It could have been a light, but it wasn't." Fittingly enough, Gillett's piece seemed to be steeped in a frustration that Cliff wasn't catching a break from the British listening public or the media. Quote, "The British music business, from TV and radio producers through nightclub bookers to fashion-conscious journalists, should be ashamed that this talented man has had to wait until a filmmaker recognized his ability." The filmmaker was Perry Henzell, and the movie was The Harder They Come. Cliff's unlikely but indelible leading man role in a story about an aspiring singer-turned-outlaw was the first all-Jamaican feature motion picture, a drama with documentary caliber rendering of a land tourists don't see. Cliff told Vivian Goldman in a 1979 Melody Maker career retrospective that Henzell saw something arresting in the photos on Cliff's self-titled 1969 LP, the one that Many Rivers to Cross appeared on. Quote, "He said that in the face on the front he saw a positive person, and in the face on the back he saw a negative person." That duality was key to the film, in which the naive, hopeful country boy becomes so manipulated and corrupted by the forces that keep him in poverty that he has no choice except to become a gunslinging rebel. Memorably described by an ad copy as, quote, "top of the hit parade and #1 on the most wanted list," Ivan's arc is that of a pop singer turned weed dealer who earns infamy after gunning down multiple police officers in a desperate bid for self-preservation. He becomes a fugitive whose notoriety means a big hit, the titular "The Harder They Come," for Hilton, the rip-off record producer who cut his session. Late in the film, there's a cynical exchange between Hilton and the corrupt weed supplier cop who's obsessed with capturing him. "Do me a favor," says Hilton. "You tell me when you catch him so I can get him to make another record for me before you string him up." It sounds like the stuff of myth, but it's also an echo of Ivanhoe Martin's real-world namesake, Vincent Ivanhoe Martin, aka Ragging, who was hailed as an outlaw folk hero in late 40s Jamaica for his lurid exploits and audacious statements to the press. Ragging wasn't involved in either the music business or the marijuana trade, but updating his character to a more early 70s milieu, complete with the bravado gleaned from spaghetti westerns, made Cliff's version of him feel every bit as real and mythological as the genuine article. Pivotally, the music itself wasn't the only credible part of the film's take on the Jamaican recording industry. Hilton gives Ivan a flat $20 for his recording, no royalties, no residuals, just barely enough to put him in a new set of threads or two. As didactic as Hilton's declaration might sound that I make the hits, not the public, I tell the DJs what to play, there really was a small group of tastemakers that held full control over the dozens of singles the artists cut every month. In the real world, during Cliff's come up in the 60s, a singer's destiny was in the hands of producers and selectors like King Edwards, Duke Reed, Coxsone Dodd, and Prince Buster. Buster himself shows up in a cameo, rejecting Ivan's efforts to promote his single independently because doing so would bring Hilton's wrath down on his head. Despite the appearance of a competitive market, most of these producers had limited scope to break a record nationwide. Even if a blue flame hot hit could convince one of these other sound system operators to spin a song they didn't have a hand in producing, spreading it further required taking to the airwaves. And that meant you either went through an independent station or you more likely had to push it through state-owned radio, which was reluctant at best to promote anything with the air of protest or slack morals. That becomes one authority flouting key to Ivan's story. When the police try to make Hilton cooperate by pulling Ivan's hit from circulation, Hilton laments that this is one case where the public really did make the hit. I can't make this record die again. Yes, I can usually do it, but it's gone too far now. The song's on the charts, the people of an outlaw, and Ivan's finally getting his share of what's his. Should we have some more? Should I go a little further, or is that a good excerpt?
Sorry, no, that's not your fault. That's my fault. I was trying to open the questions up and getting a lot of confusion here. However, I'm going to ask you a question about that, specifically about that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read a little bit of the quote again, which is that Henzel said that, quote, in the face, on the front of Cliff's 1969 LP, he saw a positive person, and in the face on the back, he saw a negative person. And you talk in that excerpt about what I'm going to shorthand as Cliff's eagerness to cross over. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about his public persona before and after the film. Did it shift after the film?
I mean, I feel like it, must have to some extent. I mean, when you have, circa, 2010s dubstep artists releasing cuts like Bad Like Jimmy Cliff, then yeah, obviously he does have some of that residual rep from the film. Although I do like the quote. I mean, like in 1980, he was quoted as saying in The Enemy that I wasn't personally a bad man, because if I was a bad man, I would be the baddest man. And that's a pretty interesting way of putting it too, I think. Just sort of having to navigate what kind of person you have to be as a performer and a public figure, and how to balance that with your actual history and, the need to be honest with yourself. And I do know that, I mean, yeah, he was an ambassador for the genre. He basically more or less came of age and grew up alongside it. I mean, I think he was like 19 going on 20 when he performed at the World's Fair, yeah. So
This is in 64?
Yeah, 64. And yeah, that's the same year as My Boy Lollipop. So it's kind of like, yeah, he's like one of the people getting his foot in the door and like schlepping through the UK. I mean, trying to figure out how to like adjust to the culture as well as the music scene, and just kind of like the fact that the appetite for ska and reggae had not, grown to the point of, where, you'd have like the skinhead culture at the end of the 60s that helped kind of sustain that as a crossover thing. But it is kind of interesting just to consider like his career as a parallel for like the first decade of reggae crossover and penetration into the States and the UK. And the funny thing is, like, Many Rivers to Cross, is one of those crossover songs. It like you could take out his vocals and replace them with, Wilson Pickett or Aretha Franklin, and it you never could tell it was originally cut by a reggae musician.
Right. Yeah.
So
Well,
it's pretty funny that well, and yeah, and then there's also on the soundtrack is "Sitting in Limbo," which is one of the songs he cut in the Muscle Shoals sessions for uh, that one album.
right. Yeah. Well, I
But
mean,
as far as but like as far as his general persona, I mean, just going off his actual music and his recorded output, he always struck me as more like a social conscious sort of singer. I mean, he played this gun-toting outlaw, but before that, I mean, his most contentious contribution to the music world is the protest song Vietnam. I
right.
mean,
Yeah. But it's also interesting that he was not a Rastafarian. And
yeah,
Rastafarianism is kind of the motor that made Jamaican music global in a way. The more local it was, the more exotic it was, in a sense.
yeah, and he was basically literally succeeded on Island Records by Bob Marley and the Wailers.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to ask a question that I've asked you this before, but in a different setting, but I'm curious. You mentioned in the book that there was a real world Ivan O. Martin, aka Vincent, aka Ragging, that you call an outlaw folk hero in late 40s Jamaica who inspired the movie character. And I'm curious, what was the relationship with that real life person and the character Cliff plays? Did it map on exactly, or were there significant differences?
I mean, there are, some significant differences. Like I said, like Ragging was, not a singer, and he, didn't, deal in the ganja. He was just, I guess he was just like a bank robber, like John Dillinger type figure, and he got that kind of similar outlaw cachet that a lot of the Depression era bank robbers had. He just had the, I guess, Jamaican equivalent of it, but like one of the like real like most direct uh homages to Ragging was the photo shoot session. There's a montage where we see Ivan come into this photo studio, and he's like, I want you to take all these photos of me and send them to the press. And he's like posing with these guns, and like kind of like it's almost like he's doing like he's putting out a promo photo. So and and that's what Reagan did. He sent photos of himself looking like a gun-toting badass. It's like, here I am. Here's a picture of me, but you haven't caught me yet. What can you do? And so that was like that sort of feeling.
That's also like Bonnie and Clyde.
Oh yeah, who you don't want to end up like, per
Right.
the Israelites. Yeah.
So I want to draw back a little bit and just talk about the book more generally. Do you recall the first time that a song appeared in a movie and altered your opinion of it? And does that movie appear in the book?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I had to kind of think about that a bit when you brought that question up the first time. But I think for some reason I thought of bad moments first, like, cliches, like, where people go to the well too many times, and you can't put Fortunate Son in your Vietnam period piece anymore without getting eye rolls because it's just been completely rinsed. But I'm pretty sure one of my earlier ones was one I alluded to in the book. I mean, I listened to a lot of classic rock radio as a kid, and I thought, Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild was this, kind of intense, exciting, like vaguely dangerous sounding song when I first heard it. I was like 9 or 10. And then almost immediately afterwards, I started seeing it used in all these trailers for these really broad slapstick family comedies all over the early 90s. And I thought, well, so much for that. I mean, I think the only time it's actually been used post Easy Rider where it actually worked was in Lost in America. And because it was just a direct undercutting of, it was
It's a
basically
parody of that scene.
exactly. Yeah. And compete upending it. But as far as like in positive terms, and this is one I mentioned in the book, but Night Ranger's Sister Christian of all things, because I mean, I'm a cool, late 90s, indie rock listening, hip hop listening, spin reading kid. I'm not supposed to like fucking Night Ranger. That shit's corny. But here's the scene in Boogie Nights, just the way that was used in this climactic Coke deal gone wrong scene. And I planted the idea in my mind is like, oh, okay, something that seems gauche and uncool on its own can actually find a new way to be embodied in this context that brings out these new angles to it. And it's like, yeah, this bloated AOR power ballad actually has some latent potential to really heighten the tension and operatic drama of this situation, where it might have just sounded out of place and pompous and goofy. You just heard it by happenstance in a mundane, ordinary day over like a the playing over the PA at Walgreens or whatever. So yeah, sometimes a song that seems like it's fatuous or superficial, just as a individual song qua song in your traditional rock crit sense, can find an occasion to rise up to.
Right. Well, you also talk in the outro, you mentioned that movie in the outro, and you also talk about another movie that popped into mind that uses something you're not supposed to like. And in this case, it doesn't actually make the song better, but it's apt, which of course is American Psycho.
Oh, hip to be square. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. I mean, yeah, that is actually a pretty funny example of a few different layered sort of intersections of film and music and literature, because
And taste.
because it's interrogating 5 different things at once, as far as like, okay, on the textual level, you have this is an adaptation of a novel that kind of transposes a passage that's just a bit of narrative into a very specific context of an actual murder scene, and to kind of juxtapose the act of killing with this display of, I would say, pseudo quasi poptimist criticism that is actually kind of just bland and superficial, really does kind of get at sort of all the different ways people try to find meaning in something that they don't actually grasp the meaning of.
Right.
Just,
You were saying? Were you finished or?
oh, no, I'm fine.
Okay. Well, let me jump to another film, an earlier film. There were a lot of songs that were considered, you mentioned, for the Easy Rider soundtrack, and I'm curious if you knew any that didn't make it in.
I'm afraid I don't. I mean, I read that there was, like a pool of a couple hundred that, Fonda and Hopper were going through. But, yeah, I mean, Hopper, I guess, wanted to sort of capture this same or a similar atmosphere as a freeform FM radio station, where you just tune in and, they're just, playing something regardless of, whether or not it's germane to the situation. But ironically, it also actually wound up becoming one of those films where, like, it's hard for me to hear anything else that could have fit most of these cinematic juxtapositions better. Like The Wait, or If 6 Was 9, or The Pusher. I mean, some things about the movie have really kind of aged into something sort of disillusioning when you think about the whole conquest of cool aspect of how the counterculture was initially ridiculed in the 60s before being commercialized in the 70s. But it really is just a fantastic example of how effective needle drops can be, especially in the calmer moments that are just like travelogue or mood setting. It all hits really dead on without feeling excessively on the nose, even if Born to Be Wild got kind of rinsed in successive years. But it is like the process. I mean, it just had to happen that way, because initially, like there's the conflicting stories depending on who you ask about how much of a shot Crosby, Stills, and Nash had of kind of scoring the film and kind of creating their own original soundtrack. Hopper was basically opposed to the idea, and presumably in retrospect, at least David Crosby was like, yeah, well, these supposed temp tracks you chose for the film are a lot better than what we could do, so why don't you go with that?
Right. Now, you mentioned in the book a string of Easy Rider inspired existential road movies would follow the original. And I can think of a couple of myself, but I'm curious if any that you might have been thinking of had any significant needle drops themselves.
The one that comes to mind for me is probably Vanishing Point from 1971. And that's actually an interesting period in that it feels like kind of a diminishing returns attempt to capture that same lightning. I mean, it's a pretty good film, but its soundtrack is kind of interesting in that it is very much one of those transitional phase things where we're hovering between this like remnant psychedelia and the emergent country rock sounds. So you have like stuff like Delaney and Bonnie and Friends and Jerry Reed and Doug Dillard. And then you also have like, Mountains, Mississippi Queen is the big, heavy rock number. And there's a big Mama Thornton gospel song. And that's kind of like what this sort of semi-multicultural Western Americana and existential crisis milieu kind of seems to feel like at that particular moment. So yeah, and then within the next couple of years, there's basically, the whole counterculture outlaw biker road trip thing is kind of run its course. Although Two Lane Blacktop being a kind of a fantastic film, but also a unfortunately poorly received one might have had something to do with that. And that one's interesting because I don't really remember much, music in that one at all, even though, two of its leads are James Taylor and Dennis Wilson.
Right. I'm thinking of a movie from 1973 titled Electra Glide in Blue. And
Oh,
did you ever see it?
no, you told me it's not very
It's
good.
not very good, but it stars Robert Blake as a cop on a motorcycle. It's almost like Easy Rider in reverse. It's nearly 3 hours long. It's a little sodden. The thing about it, though, that's interesting is that the score was by Terry Kath, the guitar player for the band Chicago.
Hmm.
And I think, and the movie was directed by James William Guercio, who, as our friend Brian once put it, led Chicago around by the nose ring. So, um, so no surprises there. I want to actually, because we keep saying needle drop, so I want to maybe go into that phrase a little bit because I want to ask what your specific parameters for inclusion in this book were.
Like as far as like my choice of like what songs to pick and what films.
Well, I mean, the basic idea to me, and I want this in your words, if you could, these are not songs composed for the films.
Right. These are songs. I like the term Ann Powers used in when she wrote about the Oscars for NPR last year is best adapted song. Yeah, which is basically a song that already exists. You take it, you license it, you put it in your film, changes the film, changes the song. It's like the knock-on effect that can kind of happen when you have these sort of juxtapositions of film and music that sort of can kind of like transform the meaning of both pieces of media in ways that maybe were not necessarily foreseen, or sometimes that were very carefully calculated. It's kind of a wide range of possibilities there.
They certainly weren't what the musicians had intended.
Oh no, usually not. Although there are some cases where the musicians were kind of complicit in that. We could like I think you wanted to bring up Crush Groove at some point, and that was kind of an interesting clash of history and fiction there.
Right, but the song you focus on there is King of Rock, which had existed before Crush Groove, as opposed to, say, a song that was done for that movie soundtrack.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to just very quickly, because, well, not very quickly, but to go back a little bit to Easy Rider, something I read kind of about Repo Man actually is that one of its producers was Michael Nesmith of the Monkees.
Oh yeah.
And he obviously comes up during the Easy Rider chapter because the people who make Easy Rider are the people who created the Monkees TV show. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of consonances between the films you discuss, a lot of, repeating personas, not necessarily leads or music supervisors or anything like that, but, musicians, players, whatever, who are some of the people that pop up multiple times in the book that maybe surprised you, or kind of like that you weren't necessarily expecting to see do that repeatedly within the text?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, for one thing, I didn't plan it out this way, but I do find it kind of funny that this book is bookended by chapters on Scorpio rising and Drive. I mean, because like a minute after like starting my research on Drive, I'm like, oh right, the jacket. Yeah, that Drive has Ryan Gosling in that satin jacket with a scorpion on the back, which is a sort of a Kenneth Anger twofer, since it also invokes the satin jacket from Lucifer Rising, and then reference previous film was called Valhalla Rising. So obviously there's kind of that lineage there. But that's more of like an obvious influence than a funny sort of 6 Degrees connection like you were making.
I guess I'm thinking like, Nesmith is just a person who winds up being involved with these movies more than once. And
Yeah.
I think Roy Orbison comes up a couple of places, obviously in Blue Velvet.
Blue Velvet, yeah. And was he also on, I don't know, was it in Scorpio Rising, or was that I'm trying to.
I have not. This is where I show my hand. I have not seen Scorpio Rising.
Yeah, I saw it, and I've
Bad critic.
memorized the soundtrack. No, I'm trying. I think I accidentally Mandela affecting myself into trying to recall if there was a Roy Orbison song on the soundtrack, um, but like recurring people, I don't know, but I did, think of like a recurring theme, or kind of like an echoing theme that I wanted to kind of take note of, that I thought was kind of interesting, is that we kind of alluded to this with when we were talking about The Harder They Come, but there's 2 soundtracks on here that both served as genre gateways, while also dropping at extremely like pivotal moments for the genres that would render these gateways potentially out of date. The Harder They Come for reggae, and Saturday Night Fever for disco. They both dropped right as these major cultural shifts. Like The Harder They Come was 72. Like Bob Marley releases his first album on Island the following year, and there's also like the emergence and popularization of not just Rastafarianism, but also dub, and all the engineering and sonic kind of flourishes and tricks that effect has on reggae. And then Saturday Night Fever, I mean, it's the biggest album in 1978, but it sounds like a 1976 period piece, because there's no chic and there's no synth disco post I Feel Love. It's very much in the kind of like post Philly International sort of phase.
Right. And it's also, and this is very critical, you allude to I Feel Love, but in an overall sense, it's before automation kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
Like drum machines are heard spottily on records before 77, but starting in 77, this is the year the synthesizer comes in full force and into pop and the drum machine.
Well, yeah, it's if you can't hire MFSB, what can you do?
Right. How long had you been thinking about writing this book before you sat down and started to map it out?
Oh, for a while. I mean, like I had done a few pieces or contributed to a few pieces sort of along those lines. I mean, after like when I was hanging out with my editor and my agent, after the completion of my first book, my agent brought the subject up. He was like, "Yeah, that would be a kind of an interesting idea for a book," and it had kind of like been brewing in the back of my mind. I mean, there's I'd contributed to this listicle on the film website The Dissolve a while back that and it inspired a bit of the spirit of the book, and it did have get me wondering how some of these songs sort of, or how some of these needle drops kind of came to be, and what sort of long-term effects they might have went through.
I mean, the stories behind some of them are just are really interesting. This, the making of the soundtrack of American Graffiti, the
Yeah.
making of, the story of how the Doors end up in Apocalypse Now when they're on the cutting room floor, literally on the cutting room floor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, you can tell a few different stories this way too. I mean, there's like the how-to of how this happened and the effect it had on our artist's career. But then it's also, I wanted to sort of explore some of the more aesthetic effects of these sort of juxtapositions. Like, what does it mean when, uh, like, thinking about like how Elliott Smith's Needle in the Hay sort of fit into the sort of mise en scène that Wes Anderson brings to the table, and what sort of effect that might have on people's impressions of Anderson's tastes as being sort of twee or superficial or on the surface, when there's actually some more emotional depth to it. So yeah, there's a lot of directions you can go in this sort of conversation.
Well, were there any film writers in particular who inspired your approach here?
I mean, that's actually kind of tricky. I mean, there's nobody really specific I feel like I share a voice with per se, or have the influence of. I mean, I've read a whole bunch of Roger Ebert, and there are bloggers who catch my eye, like Walter Chaw or Nick Pinkerton, but I don't really know how much direct influence they've had on my perspective. I mean, the funny thing is that even though I have my own critical tastes and I tend to know and trust certain writers when it comes to music, I don't really have entirely that same connection with film writing, even though I know good film writing when I see it, the stuff that articulates a sort of knowledge and observation that the layperson might take for granted or not quite be able to put their finger on. But there aren't really any specific writerly voices or sensibilities I kind of gravitate towards the same way that I do with music. Um, I will say that it is kind of funny though that sometimes, when I do write about music, especially if it's like instrumental or otherwise sort of thematically intangible stuff, I do kind of think about it in terms of trying to envision sort of cinematic, or, like almost like visualized kind of just sort of a cinematic sense of what it evokes to me. So
Were you tempted to include any documentaries?
oh boy, I wish I had thought of that, because at the very least I would have included this in my kind of postscript extra songs, or additional choices. I mean, Michael Moore dropping the Beach Boys "Wouldn't It Be Nice" the way he did in Roger and Me was one of the most pungently, like, bleak things I've ever seen in a documentary. So basically, if you haven't seen it, one of his friends, who was a laid off auto worker who was in mental health treatment at the time, he's filmed talking about how the constant layoffs at GM were really stressing him out so much that he was having a nervous breakdown, and how he tried to kind of allay that by turning on the radio during a panic attack stricken drive home. And he tried singing along to "Wouldn't It Be Nice" and realizing just how futile and sad it felt. And then bang, we get the needle drop over a minute plus of footage of the abandoned homes and storefronts in Flint, Michigan, intercut with headlines about more layoffs, and news reports about how the rat population has outpaced the humans. And I just watched it for the first time in a long time, and it was still just a massive kick to the stomach all over again. It's just incredibly brutal.
Were there any animated films you were tempted to do this with?
I don't know. I think by the time like animated films really started to do this a lot, instead of the traditional Disney original song thing, like Shrek was after my time. I am not in the Shrek audience at all. So there's probably been more, there's probably been a lot of think pieces about how, you know, All Star or Hallelujah were really, had their contexts sort of warped by that film. But yeah, that's the only one that immediately comes to mind. And I am on the record as not being into that whole intellectual property. Although I will say it is one of the funniest things I ever heard. To Shrek's credit, William Steig, his son, was a flautist who was sampled by the Beastie Boys for Sure Shot, and they used that as kind of a sort of in joke in the second film, by like, oh, they show the Pied Piper of Hamelin shows up, and that's his theme song. So kudos to DreamWorks for that little music dork, nugget there.
Nate, I have to say, for a guy who doesn't like Shrek, you seem to know a lot about Shrek.
We're on the millennial internet. You have to know about Shrek if you want to survive on the millennial internet.
If you say so, sir. You talk about Hype Williams being consistently over budget, even, quote, when most of his videos were just crowds of people milling around a burning barrel or an empty warehouse, close quote. One of my favorite piquant little descriptions of somebody's work from the book. Now, normally, this would give a studio or a producer pause before hiring a director. Why did Williams get the green light, and would he receive it today?
Yeah, wow. I mean, Belly is, to me, like, really a fairly disappointing film for reasons largely out of Hype Williams' control. I mean, the later question, I want to answer first, because I was thinking about, like, oh, would a music video director get that kind of shot today? I mean, I was wondering, well, is the music video to motion picture pipeline still a thing? And then I realized, yes, the people responsible for the Turn Down for Wet video won a whole bunch of Oscars for Everything Everywhere All at Once. So,
but how old is Turn Down for What?
10 years.
Right. I mean, that's 10 years ago. Is there anybody now in that pipeline?
I have no idea. I don't even know who directs music videos anymore. But
musicians' moms.
TikTok, yeah, themselves. But as far as how Hype got the chance in the first place, I mean, I think there is probably some kind of lowballing compromise at work, because, like I say, he was like the biggest possible budgets for music videos, going from that to low budget feature films. I mean, it's like he was given a shot because he was such an attention-getting filmmaker. Probably the most strikingly unique and distinct one working in nearly any form of media at that time. Like, he basically embodied my ideal vision of what the late 90s futurist popular culture was and what it would look like, just for, his Missy Elliott and Busta Rhymes videos. I think the problem was that, he didn't have nearly as much creative or financial leeway for Belly as he should have, because, the producers considered it a hood movie. And I'm guessing they weren't too confident on their return of investment, even though one of its leads, DMX, was in the process of becoming, one of the best-selling rappers of his or any other era.
Isn't 98 when he had 2 #1 albums?
Yeah. I think it was like 98, cusp of 98, 99. Yeah. And so, I mean, the film didn't turn out as great as it could have been. Like, if the whole thing had the budget to make it feel like the title sequence in that early mansion scene where we get the full impact of his surrealist hyper-modern aesthetic, then, and if it was also given enough credit by the producers to be the 2-hour plus Fallen Redemption, moral arc crime epic it could have been, instead of the, 90-minute, dump it to cable disjointed narrative it was cut down to, who knows where we'd be. But as far as, like, Williams, I mean, that actually had me thinking about one of the other what ifs of his era. Chris Cunningham, he never made that leap at all, and he was, never showed much interest in doing so. He was, I guess, probably skeptical of it. But the closest he ever got was some early stage plans to adapt William Gibson's Neuromancer, and the gulf between how cool that could have been and how much leeway Hollywood would have given him was, probably really, really wide. So,
right. Well, and this is also the parallel between indie rock briefly having its moment in the sun in the mid-90s and indie film doing the same is also not to be discounted.
Oh yeah. People thought that the internet and digital technology would expand that a lot more than it actually did.
Right. Well, I want to ask a little bit about Wayne's World,
Hmm.
my favorite chapters in the book. You talk about how that film champions slacker culture over the yuppie ethos, and I'm curious, I like just from what you have watched in film generally, would you say that that has reversed over the last 3 decades with maybe the nonstop hustle ethos now sort of holding sway?
Maybe. I mean, I don't like to be a generational essentialist, although I will, shit talk my own Gen X cohort nonstop just for yucks. But I mean, I don't know enough 20 somethings to have a full grasp on the scenario. And I know there's a huge contrast between, a young person in the 90s having enough of an economic foothold to feel like they can, afford to avoid selling out, and a young person now who sees nothing but dead ends when it comes to class mobility. I mean, I do know that the yuppie seems more or less extinct. Maybe what we have instead is the yutbie, the young urban thwarted bourgeoisie. Someone who hoped to climb some sort of career ladder, but grew some kind of politics of some type or another, whether socialist or reactionary, around the fact that they can't, that there is no mobility. And I don't know what long-term effect this might have on counterculture per se, aside from the fact that I don't think counterculture can really exist in the way that it used to, because of our underlying economic conditions can't sustain non-commercial scenes. That and the fact, well, maybe not the fact, but I feel like it seems pretty clear that fandom of mass culture entertainment seems to have largely supplanted identification with subcultural aesthetics. I think maybe the starkest contrast I can think of in the context of Wayne's World is the fact that in this movie, yeah, Wayne and Garth are worried that they're selling out by helping some guy shill his video arcade. And now their modern day equivalent is not on cable access, they're on Twitch, and they're pulling the same sort of comedic slackers hanging out vibe while playing video games.
Right. Yeah, there you go. I think this might be a good time to is if Antonia is there to maybe read some of the questions or have some of the audience questions. But before we do that, I have one final question for you, Nate. What are we watching tomorrow night?
Oh, I have not yet picked something out, but considering, yeah, we tried watching Infinity Pool last week and I could not sit through it. I had to tap out, so I am probably going to pick something light and fun and breezy. I
Awesome.
still haven't seen the new Spider-Verse movie, so I think we could do that.
Oh, awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Just for the people watching, Nate and I live in the same house. He's upstairs, I am downstairs. So, Antonia, please.
Thank you so much. This discussion has already been so rich, and there are a ton of questions. Let me scroll to the top and okay. Keith DRC, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Nate. Thank you. This is fun and fantastic. I just ordered the book, so I haven't read it yet, but I'm wondering, what was the earliest example that you found in your research of a needle drop being used for pure dramatic effect that was not coming out of a radio or a jukebox or someone singing it on camera?
That's a good question, because I know I mean, Scorpio Rising is kind of an interesting case in that it is basically like the soundtrack, the music is the only sound. So in that sense, it is almost, integral to the way that the narrative is sort of unfolds. On the other hand, like in terms of just, I mean, The Sound of Silence is kind of the, maybe not necessarily the first ever example, but probably the most notable example of a song sort of working, like a pre-existing pop song working as something other than simply a title theme a la Rock Around the Clock for Blackboard Jungle, in that it kind of, yeah, it does serve as a sort of non-diegetic, i.e. the song exists in the world of the film and not in the characters in the film listening to it. Yeah, I think that in The Graduate is sort of the, maybe not the case, but probably the most famous early example. Yeah.
I did want to go ahead.
It's the blueprint, very much so.
I want to mention, I just rewatched Rear Window the other night that was playing at the Alamo here in New York. And I realized that there is a popular song being used to dramatic effect in that film, but it is coming out of a radio. There's a scene of a lovelorn woman who's she's contemplating committing suicide. There's a song that plays on the radio, but the song is definitely being used to telegraph what's going on in her head. But it's coming out of a radio.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways that these sort of juxtapositions are sort of played with and messed with. I like one of my favorite examples, and Back to the Harder They Come, is the fact that, okay, we see basically the entire musical career arc of Ivan, but we see him sing The Harder They Come. And okay, yeah, it's Jimmy Cliff. It's Jimmy Cliff singing a Jimmy Cliff song for a Jimmy Cliff film. But then later we hear at the beginning of the film and then later in the film, Cliff's version of You Can Get It If You Really Want. And we hear it at some point, like we hear it in the beginning of the film, as Ivan is arriving to the city from the country, and he's embarking on his journey. And then we hear it again on the radio as we see Ivan, now on the run as an outlaw criminal, doing business with someone else. And it's like, okay, this guy sings like Ivan, but we know it's not Ivan, but we know it's Jimmy Cliff. So it is kind of like, the fourth wall being shaken in a kind of a funny way.
Thanks for that. I think the next question is by Alex Vesey, if you want to unmute.
Hi. First off, Nate, I really enjoyed this book. I just finished reading it. I have lots of questions, but to limit it to just one, I was curious about your thoughts about the term needle drop. I've wondered a lot about how it's like the sort of, I don't know, when it came into vogue. I'm actually not sure when that term originates, but it's gotten a lot of circulation in recent years in like the streaming age, which to me is really interesting because a lot of your examples kind of point out the materiality of the music being played by various characters within the story world. And so I was curious about your thoughts on that term needle drop and how it circulates and how it kind of calls attention to the materiality of listening to music as a fan practice within the movies. That is a fascinating
point. Yeah, it's almost like there is some cosmic hand dropping a stylus down onto a filmic LP, and then that's how you get, and that's how you get that kind of, it makes it sound like a very deliberate choice, which it is, and making it sound like a deliberate choice may actually kind of break the kayfabe of a song feeling like it is a sort of almost moment of fate, or now got me kind of caught up in these sort of existential questions that are coming from an angle I hadn't entirely considered. So I mean, I do think that that it doesn't have any, for me, doesn't have any connection to that one YouTube critic. I'm not like having anything to do with that, but it is, I'm not sure why that specific term took off, especially since it really does sound like a very analog thing.
The term needle drop, as far as I mean, I've always heard it in the context of DJ culture. It's what people who are crate digging did to, ascertain what their finds were, they'd bring a little record player and just drop it.
Well, yeah, and that makes sense to me too, which is funny because now like that stirs like my what I had to say about Goodfellas, that whole that whole Coke paranoia sequence in the third act, that sounds like a DJ set. It's a series of music cues, but it's like sequenced, like there's like maybe one moment where there's a little bit of breathing room between songs, but like the entire way, it's like, yeah, going back and forth from, Jump into the Fire into What is Life into Magic Bus into Manish Boy and back. And it's like, dang, Marty and Thelma, I'd like to hear one of their residencies.
Rahad and Boogie Nights too, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that was mixtape culture too. There's like it was like almost, I feel like there are very few moments I've seen in a film that were like, I have been there, as much as the bit where the song cuts off mid-tape because he lost track of like how much time was left on that side.
There was a interaction between Chris Melanthe and Landon Palmer about the earliest use of pre-existing songs. I didn't know if that was a question or just commentary.
It was mostly commentary, but I'm actually pleased to hear Nate, without even seeing my comment, actually affirming that The Graduate and Simon and Garfunkel is as seminal as it is, because there was an Atlantic article some years back that I've actually cited in a couple of my pieces that posits that the use of Simon and Garfunkel pre-existing songs in that movie is kind of a before and after moment. And I guess Scorpio Rising predates that by 3 or 4 years, but it sounds like it's about as important as the article suggests. I was a little skeptical about that, but it's nice to hear you affirm the primacy of that.
Yeah, but there's also just like a long tradition of, I mean, standards I'm sure get used, were used all the time during, like the Hays Code era, and there's always, little motifs and things that kind of pop up just as part of the shared language of show business. So I think I kind of focused a little more on just the way that things sort of started to change once rock and roll started to become kind of a big ticket business in the 60s. So, and how that sort of symbiosis also dovetailed, funnily enough, with Hollywood's tendency to abandon the Hays Code in an attempt to kind of start recapturing youth culture, and that's been like a multi-generational sense of symbiosis ever since.
There's one other thing to consider here, which is the collapse of the studio system in the 50s, because then you had, the studio system meant that there were orchestras on call, and there were entire bands and composers and things like that, everything was done in the studio, including the music. When the studio system ends in the 50s, that doesn't exist anymore, and it takes a few years for Hollywood to sort of catch up with the rest of the culture, which is like forming around the recordings themselves as opposed to the songs.
It reminds me of a theory that I'd heard, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is that one of the reasons that jazz started to become kind of a popular go-to for film in the 50s and 60s, these jazz soundtracks, Duke Ellington, Miles Davis et al., was that there are smaller combos, less people to pay,
Cost
Yeah.
sure.
I encourage people to look at the chat for the exchange about the earliest use of that, The Graduate, but then also Landon Palmer talked about Nothing But a Man, which was an indie film from '64. So
what was the title of that again?
Nothing But a Man, an independent film about African Americans from '64.
I think I heard about this. Is this one of those films that was sort of lost because
I think Criterion's doing a release soon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it got very limited distribution during its original release, like mainly like non-theatrical spaces like churches and community centers and places like that. But it was very much ahead of its time in terms, it licensed, I think, 11 Motown songs for $5,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but just like a really early example of this, that's just kind of a interesting historical footnote with respect to The Graduate and then all the other new Hollywood movies that did this on the regular.
Mm-hmm.
That was Ivan Dixon, right?
Yes, it was. Ivan Dixon starred in it, but he didn't direct it.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Carl Wilson.
Great, thanks. This seems like a good transition out of what you were just talking about the sort of. So if we look at it from, that kind of 60s graduate moment through to the 70s, 80s, 90s, like one thing I wonder as you went through this kind of history is, did you see an evolution? I wonder, and this kind of ties into generational things as well, in the ways that directors, sort of auteurs, seem to be positioning themselves in relationship to their soundtracks. Like it seems like with something like The Graduate, the point of having the pop songs there is very much like, hey, we're up with the youth. But like by the time you get to like Tarantino and their ilk in the 90s, there's definitely a very different way that the director is positioning their tastes and that kind of thing. And I'm curious how you feel that's evolved to today as well.
That's pretty interesting, because one of the things that I kept going back to when I was doing these Q&As was thinking about like how, like when I really started to get into like real, like I want to be a critic levels of, music and film enthusiasm, in my teen years, that kind of dovetailed with this stretch of like period pieces that I was really interested in like I didn't get to Dazed and Confused until a lot later, but I, in like generally more or less close succession, well, over the course of a few years, it was like Casino, Brooklyn, Boogie Nights, The Virgin Suicides. There were like these films that were kind of like using these, like they were all period pieces, taking place in the 70s, and they were all kind of putting out each of them had sort of their own idiosyncratic or personalized sort of perspectives on what pop music of the era was back then. And so it's kind of interesting to see how well, like in the case of The Graduate, I mean, Mike Nichols, yeah, he had that sort of like, I want to get into the minds of the kids, and then he listens to this, he listens to Simon and Garfunkel, and he like actually finds this real connection to it. So it's coming to it from a place of trying to figure that out, to like people like Scorsese who are absolutely steeped in it. And I think that they're or alternately, like and sometimes, like in the case of like Charles Burnett with Killer of Sheep, one of the things that really struck me was that, I mean, he was he was a student, he was in his 20s, he was making this film in the 1970s, but it was like the soundtrack was largely like kind of reckoning with the music that he'd grown up listening to as a child, which was like largely the blues and like like Dinah Washington, and he is sort of using that to comment on this sort of community and this intergenerational relationships that were kind of being alluded to when you cut between like Stan's life and then going back to footage like the kids running through the neighborhood, and sort of like the way that, I mean, there are just so many different ways I could go with this. I think in terms of like how directors sort of present their musical tastes, I think especially like post Scorsese, there is sort of and Tarantino and Spike Lee and a lot of these directors with very distinct connections to musical interests and music fandom. You really can tell, compared to some of the more, or some of the less tourist or more focus group stuff, that there's something that these auteurs have that a lot of others don't.
Can I throw one thing in? You talk in the book about Wes Anderson and Quentin Tarantino basically making mixtapes to write their scripts to. And that seems like the mode for a lot of auteurs is like, when The Graduate, when we hear The Sound of Silence, we get the idea that this is what's going on in Benjamin's head. Whereas when we hear a soundtrack from Tarantino or Wes Anderson, we think this is the filmmaker's taste.
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes I think that can be hard to sort of separate. I think I quote Will Oldham on Wes Anderson and how much he hates just the very concept of needle drops because it takes you out of the film. Instead of thinking about the world of the movie, you're thinking about the song you know or you don't know, and you're trying to figure out what the song is about. And I kind of get that, but also I wrote a book saying that that basically posits that actually no, this is a good thing. So I can't agree with Will at all. But yeah, I guess it just depends on how interested you are in examining a film as a self-contained story versus a film as a expression of a director's distinct sensibilities. And I think that's why people go all weird about auteur theory.
I mean, I would throw one other thing in there, just in the direction that you were sort of walking, that I think about the use much more common in the past couple of decades. I think the first example that really stands out in my mind is Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, of period pieces that use distinctly anachronistic music. And and like almost deliberately seeming to pull you out of the period and make you think about there being an intelligence floating somewhere behind the film that's trying to make you make connections.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that was like the first time I was asked that question during a radio appearance. I was actually kind of thrown. I was like, wow, yeah, I hadn't even considered that. But yeah, just the idea of the anachronistic soundtrack, or anachronistic, I've never figured out how to pronounce that. Yeah, I think it probably helps in some ways to give people a more familiar grounding in sort of like a far-flung context, such as like, well, in one way, yeah, if you want to get like a full picture of how this film wants you to feel about the opulence and decadence of the pre-revolutionary France, then sure, yeah, maybe getting people to kind of bask in the glow of Thatcher era synth pop is a good way to do that. And then on the other hand, it can also just be a funny way to sort of give familiarity to an unfamiliar setting, like in the complete other end of the scale, what the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie does. It's like, okay, here's this guy having all these weird fantastical adventures in completely incomprehensible science fiction outer space worlds. Dude likes blue Swede. Let's give people something to hang on to there.
Alice Boone, do you feel like your question was answered in the previous questions, or just checking in?
I think it was answered in the previous question, but I actually had a follow-up question, if that's okay. I was just watching an episode of Poker Face the other night, and Ngozi family comes on at the end of at the very end, the end credits. And that to me follows, Noah Hawley, maybe a few other directors, where they kind of do a really interesting directorial choice for end credit needle drop, which seems to maybe follow an earlier question about materiality in needle drops, where this is the end. I'm gonna mark it with something that's it's not really diegetic or non-diegetic. It's instead serving its own function. I've wondered if you had a theory of that.
Oh, wow. I don't have a very specific theory, but I do have an example of that I love to bits. It's in the movie Green Room. where if you don't know the premise, it's basically a extremely violent and harrowing thriller about a punk band who winds, like, there's no gigs, so they have to, wind up inadvertently getting booked at a Nazi club, and then they play the gig, and then they, witness the Nazis doing something bad, and and then they get, have to do a, siege in the green room to protect themselves and eventually escape. It's terrifying, but it's this punk band, so everybody's like, yeah, I have really cool, awesome, really esoteric tastes, and I love all this obscure shit. But then when they start really fearing for their lives, they eventually start confessing like what their actual favorite songs are. And they're like, the kind of stuff that, maybe punks might, consider guilty pleasures. And the main, like the front man of the band, who is one of the last people to survive, waits until the very, very end. Like I think it's like the last scene of the movie. One of the other survivors finally asks, "So what is your real favorite song?" And he doesn't actually answer, but the end credits hit, "Sinister Purpose" by Creedence Clearwater Revival. And that, oh geez, that was like one of my all-time favorite examples of that. And yeah, that really does work as in that sort of liminal space between diegetic and non-diegetic commentary and inside commentary and outside commentary. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the best examples I can think of.
The next question was my question, which had to do, are there any songs that are more famous than the movie or that folks don't know that are from a movie? I was thinking about That's the Way of the World, which is Earth, Wind, and Fire, which is from a movie that no one's seen. Someone's probably seen it, but I found out it's from a movie from Questlove Supreme. And I wonder how common that is, that there's a song that's really famous, but people don't really know.
Yeah, I saw that movie too. I enjoyed it enough. It's interesting, I like Earth, Wind, and Fire, and I like Harvey Keitel. What's not to like? But I think there's that's almost like a parallel category. Yeah, the songs you didn't know were made for movies. Like I had to go from like initially when I was like early draft working on the book, I'm like, well, I'm gonna write about Crush Groove, and I'm gonna write about the concept of, or around the LL Cool J's little cameo where he performs "I Can't Live Without My Radio," and then I realized, oh, technically that song was more or less recorded for the film. I mean, it debuted in the film at the very least, so it was like almost concurrent release. So
I can think of a really obvious one, which is, it's even in the title, "Against All Odds" by Phil Collins.
Oh wow, yeah.
Because that movie didn't tank, but it wasn't very successful, and the only thing anybody remembers about it is the song.
That's another thing. I was watching the 92 MTV VMAs, and I was reminded, or possibly even discovered for the first time, that apparently "Tears of Heaven" by Eric Clapton is on a soundtrack. I guess it is technically a soundtrack song.
From the movie Rush.
Yeah, not the one about the 1976 Formula One season that Ron Howard directed, the other one about being addicted or something. I don't know. I've never seen it.
Insert Eric Clapton joke.
Okay. Joe Mabel, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I was wondering, if we were looking for earlier precedents, the place I would look is the roughly 5 or 6 years of sound filmmaking in Weimar, Germany, because people were doing a ton of experimentation with mixing things like this. One of the best examples is the opera by Georg Kaiser, the one-act opera Georg Kaiser and Kurt Weill, called Der Tsar lässt sich fotografieren, and the Tsar lets his photograph be taken, which they actually recorded even though it was an opera, there was one recorded song in it that when you bought the rights, like you licensed the rights, they actually sent you the disc because they wanted that played from a disc, not by the orchestra playing at the opera.
Wow.
And also Lionel Bart, this is later, but another interesting stage example. Lionel Bart in the musical Blitz, his follow-up to Oliver, actually wrote a song and commissioned Vera Lynn to record it so that it could be playing on the radio, sung by Vera Lynn within the plot of his play. And slightly different, but another British stage things. Tom Stoppard, and I think it's called The Real Thing, uses Whiter Shade of Pale several times.
Yeah.
Definitely specifically, somebody, I mean, it's definitely diegetic. Somebody puts the song on, they're arguing your highbrow versus lowbrow stuff. So I don't know, but that's especially the Weimar Germany thing. If someone really wanted to follow that up, I would bet that would be more likely than anywhere else someone might have done something similar in an earlier era.
Yeah, I mean, like a book like this has to start somewhere, but there's precedents to kind of consider and think about in ways that I think could definitely help add some like additional context and illumination and points of comparison. This is just a place to start. It's not the last word on anything. Yeah.
Yeah, no criticism intended. Just saying.
Oh no, none taken.
If someone wanted to follow up that piece, that's where I'd look.
Yeah.
I had a second question by Chris, by MTV, Chris Malamphy.
I wasn't sure we were going to have time for another question, but I'll just throw it in. Do you talk in the book at all about the moment when post-MTV film grammar kind of takes on the music video cast? Like basically, it isn't just that a needle drop is in a song, is in a movie, a la what happens in The Graduate, but like the close cutting. I mean, if you flash ahead to the late 90s, what Wes Anderson is doing in Rushmore and every movie thereafter is, it's not just that the needle drops, it's that it's like cut like a music video. Obviously on television, you can go back to Miami Vice, which is 1984, 85, and you see it there.
That was MTV Cops. There you go.
That was the pitch, literally a 2-word pitch, right? MTV Cops. But did you notice that increasing in film as you went along?
I mean, it's kind of tricky to, it feels sort of like a chicken and the egg situation to me in some ways, because I mean, a lot of like around the same time that like music videos were kind of taking off, like I'd spent a while, like part of my pandemic, just going back and looking at this archive of British commercials from like the late 70s, early 80s, where Tony Scott got his footing. And so you have these kind of overlapping sensibilities where, you have music video, you have commercial, like, commercials, like the advertising world. And then you have, the way that those sort of intersect with, not just network television or nascent cable television, but film. I mean, there's so many different directions things, can go in. And I did kind of touch on that a bit in the chapter on Belly, because that's, kind of where I got to hold forth for a bit on the wave of music video directors turned film directors, a la, David Fincher and them. But I think I could even reverse engineer to see, like, well, was the rhythm of music videos taken from 30-second jingle based quick cut ads? So
probably,
definitely.
Yeah, it's almost an Ouroboros,
A lot of the video directors came from the ad world.
Yeah. Fincher included. I think one of his first famous works was an anti-smoking PSA.
Do we have time for one last question by Ian, everybody? Okay. Ian, Balfour.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so thanks. So Carl kind of asked a version of my earlier one about the films, like, well, should I ask that again, or should I go to the covers thing?
The covers one.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if Nate, if you had considered the use of covers in films, and I gave the example of Clueless, where The Ghost in You is done by Counting Crows, and All by Myself is done by Jewel. You know, it makes sense for the logic of that film because it's an adaptation, so a redoing of Austen's novel. But I was wondering if, I don't know, it occurred to you that there's something of interest when a cover is used in a film.
Sometimes. I mean, there's a few different ways that plays out. Like going back to Royal Tenenbaums, I mean, they had the cover of Hey Jude because they couldn't secure the rights to the original, probably because they were there's like I think it was like around the time that like George Harrison was about to pass, so it was a very fraught timing there. But yeah, the other two like contexts I can think of as far as the centrality of the cover version soundtrack, yeah, there's things like I Am Sam or Me, Myself, and Irene that kind of like have like that kind of also serve as de facto tribute / soundtrack albums, to like the Beatles and Steely Dan respectively in my examples. But then the other thing that kind of gnaws at me is the what started off, or well, I don't know if necessarily started off, but it was definitely turbocharged by Donnie Darko using the Gary Jules cover of Mad World that kind of kicked off this trend of what I think would be called the slow sad cover version for trailers, which is kind of a recurring theme for big budget, bloated, weird, big ticket films that try to give themselves an air of profundity by using a really minor key down tempo version of a otherwise fairly upbeat pop song. I think the nadir was probably when some Transformers movie tried to do that with the Flaming Lips Do You Realize? So yeah, I think a lot of it, the time you have to kind of differentiate between whether there is a meaning to the new context or whether it's just somebody trying to trade off easy recognition that gets transmuted into a different version of itself.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Should we call it a night? I know my laptop battery is kind of winding down here.
I think we're at time. Thank you so much to Nate and Michaelangelo for a really great conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting.
And